This is a necessary assumption question. We can tell because the assumption is required by the argument. And that means that in order to have a valid argument, we need this assumption. It is literally necessary. And when we deny the necessary assumption, it should be really damaging to the argument. We'll no longer be able to have a valid argument. And that's one of the tests we can run for necessity. So our conclusion here is the first sentence. We can tell that that's the conclusion because with the support indicator, after all, whatever follows it supports whatever came before it. So we know this is going to be supporting that conclusion, and since is going to indicate a premise. So the conclusion is that to maintain a healthy back, you've got to exercise the muscles on opposite sides equally, and that's because balanced muscle development is necessary for a healthy back, and that's supported by the idea that muscles on opposite sides need to pull equally. They need to pull equally, so that's necessary in order to have proper alignment and protect the spine. And those sound like kind of like having a healthy back, right? We're assuming that proper alignment and a protected spine are part of having a healthy back. So at each point along the way, though, there are little gaps. There's a gap between our premise and our subsidiary conclusion. We're assuming that in order for the muscles on opposite sides to pull equally, you need to have balanced muscle development. That's the gap from here to here. And then we're also assuming that in order to have balanced muscle development, you need to exercise the muscles on opposite sides equally. So each of these gaps has an assumption, and we could talk about either one of those assumptions as being necessary. We just want to state it weakly. We don't want to overstate it because then it becomes too much to need. Let's go ahead and see which of the two assumptions the answer choices want to focus on. A says muscles on opposite sides that are equally well developed are enough to keep the back in proper alignment. And I think equally well developed sounds closest to balanced muscle development. If we're trying to figure out which term that is, I think that's balanced muscle development. But the big problem with A is that it says enough, and that's a sufficient indicator. So answer choice A is really saying that balanced muscle development is enough to give you proper alignment. And that's not anything that we need. We don't need a connection between that term and that term. If we were to draw out the chain that we need here, we're assuming that healthy back, let's start with the premise, it requires the muscles on opposite sides to pull equally, which requires balanced muscle development, which requires exercising muscles on opposite sides equally. This is the whole chain that this argument is sort of assuming. Some of the gaps in here we are assuming are true, but this is how we're getting from this idea to that idea, through the premises and the subsidiary conclusion. So A is not a connection that we need here. Answer choice B says exercising the muscles on opposite sides unequally tends to lead to unbalanced muscle development. So that's the opposite of this final term. So exercising muscles on opposite sides, if you don't do it equally, so that negated, then you're not going to have balanced muscle development. And what answer choice B is it's the contrapositive of this last link, which is the assumption here between our subsidiary conclusion and our final conclusion. That's how we know that we need B. We don't even need to deny it to test it. We are assuming that balanced muscle development requires exercising the sides equally. In other words, if you don't exercise the sides equally, you're not going to have balanced muscle development. It's the contrapositive of the link between our subsidiary conclusion and our final conclusion. That's why it's the right answer. C says, if you exercise the muscles on opposite sides equally, you will have a healthy back. Now, that's EMOS equally implies healthy back. And the problem with answer choice C is that it's the converse of our conclusion, right? We're assuming that a healthy back requires this, that this is necessary, not sufficient. C is making it sound like it's sufficient. We don't need this. We're not assuming that it goes the other way. So the problem with answer choice C is it's got the necessary and sufficient conditions reversed. And that's how we're going to talk ourselves out of it. D says if you exercise the muscles on opposite sides unequally, so it kind of starts the way that B does, your back will be irreparably damaged. But that's a whole brand new term that's not part of our argument. We're not ever assuming, nor do we need anything to be irreparably damaged. For all we know, all of these things are reversible. And so this is a new term that we're not going to need anything about. And so that's how we can convince ourselves that we don't need answer choice D. And then finally, E says you should exercise daily. And just from the start, that's not something that we need. There's nothing that says daily exercise is required, or that there's no way to really need a should here. This is a very factual argument about if you do this, then that's going to happen, but it's not about what you should do. And should is a very strong type of claim, so it's hard to need a should claim. Maybe exercising 3 times a week or once a week is the right way to do it. What we are assuming is that if you want to have a healthy back, you should exercise muscles on opposite sides equally. But that doesn't mean that it needs to be daily. And so that's our way out of E, and answer choice B is the one we need. It's the contrapositive of the connection between the subsidiary conclusion and the final.